Okay, welcome to our final section. This is entitled Server-Side Traces. What you have with a server-side trace is the same as you would have with any SQL profiler. You have the ability to capture information, and that is live queries, events, deadlocks, etc. So let's kind of have a look at that, and we'll show you examples of what that really means. And the first thing I want to do is show you the select statement from the system table called fin_trace_get_info. And I'm just going to execute it. What I want to show you is initially this. Every time you create a trace, the trace has a trace ID, with the exception of the first trace, aka the trace that starts with the system, the self-optimization. So the system already has an optimization level where it starts its own trace. It puts it to whatever the default path is, and it basically stores around 20 megabytes of information for its own internal tuning preferences. These can be changed. I wouldn't recommend them. This is much deeper into the SQL knowledge base than you want to be at this point. And what they do is they're completely dedicated for that tuning purpose. What we want to do is potentially create ones for our applications so that we can do the tuning. And there are a couple of advantages. You can open SQL Profiler and you could start tuning it remotely with your Management Studio SQL Profiler. The downside to this is your machine has to be running. You might not be there all the time to leave it running. If it goes into sleep or something, you've lost the events. But also, it tends to not let you save that information to wherever you want. So as an example, there are cases where SQL Profiler will just dump to the system disk because that's where SQL Profiler was installed. And after 2-3 hours, you've got 200-300 gig and your Windows machine falls over and crashes. There's also the scenario that your profiler might be remote and network connectivity plays a bit where you may result in missing certain information got dropped in the packet. So running it on the server side is more efficient from that perspective, as it collects the exact data as it's happening and can be dumped to file. So what I'm going to do is just quickly open SQL Profiler, and we're going to create a brand new trace. For those of you who are not familiar with it, you can see that you have a few standard templates. And one of the things that I want to divert your attention to is, let's say as an example, we go for locks. So I might be looking for deadlocks, and you can see from the event selection all lock related information is covered. Same as if I was doing tuning. The tuning template selects much fewer. Now these can be customized, they're just general ones. If you start with the default one, you'll already see that there is some selections there. And you can show all events, and then you can add ones that you want. So as an example, let's say I was debugging the CRL assembly, so CRL rather, I would just tick that and then I can capture the CRL events. Now the reason I say this is because when you're creating this, these will show up in a script later, and they're not very intuitive. They'll show up as numbers, not as names. So it's good to get your selection here before you move on. So I'm just going to go with a very standard one. I'm going to go with the tuning one, and I'm going to run it, and I can see that it started. Now if I was to go into the background and I run an execution for this, I can see it's also started here, and I can actually see the query I've run in the statement. Now I'm going to stop that because I now have the pre-selection I want. So I want to turn this into a script. So I'm going to use the export, and then I can turn this into a file. So I'm going to call this trace 1, and I'm going to save it. And that's been saved. And I'm just going to execute here. You can see trace 2 has disappeared because it's not running anymore. But I am going to open that file, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. So we know it's in documents, there's trace 1, I'm going to open it, and here we have some values. So I'm going to show you that, first of all, there you have a max size value. So this is in megabytes. So this is a 5 meg file is the max size it's going to create. I've got a path which I have to fill in. You can see the instructions above as an example. So I would maybe say that that's m slash ms sql slash, and I'm going to pretend that I've created a folder called traces. As an example, and I don't need to add the extension because that will be done by default. I can also add more options. So these are an example. These were the default options. So these are the trace IDs and then the column values, and they're just being switched on. Now remember, these are runtime values. So if you restart SQL, your trace will be lost and you'll have to execute it again. So this is something to keep in mind, that this is only switching them on for when you need them, and they're switched off when the server restarts. So it's important to remember, if you're trying to capture, let's say as an example, deadlocks, and someone restarts the server because of performance, you're going to lose everything that wasn't in that trace file. So those are the basics. Now you can do a lot more. So here I've got a prepared trace file that I've done earlier. Now in this example we've got a few more switches. So I've already set 500 megs. I've got a trace count. I've got a count on the end here. So after the date time I actually have 20. That's a rolling file count. So I will have up to 20 of these 500 meg files, but never more. I can tell it to stop by a time date. So as you can see, I can tell it to stop on exactly the 19th. Not much good to me now because it's already 21st. But I could also just decide to hash that out. And instead I could have, as an example, the get date parameters and say, give me 2 hours. So I can get 2 hours worth of information. And this might be more useful if you know roughly when it takes place, or you're just doing performance during a day and you want to see how much is taken up in that time frame. Equally, the file sizes are good because if you want to prevent, let's say, a disk filling up, let's say you've only got 2 gig for trace files, you might say, okay, I'm going to have maximum 1 gig per trace file, and I'm only going to have 2 files. So I could change that from 20 to 2. And these are useful parameters to keep in mind. Lastly, at the end of your trace is going to be a trace ID name. So just as we saw before, where we have these parameters here, you can also set the trace ID name. Now it's created, in this case, a generic auto numbering scheme with a nice long hexadecimal number, but I could also call it my trace. So I can now set that, and assuming the file path is set, which I just need to do again, as SQL, first the letter, and I should be able to execute that. Just a slight typo, I'm just going to correct that, and